Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 99, the last two-digit episode in, I was going to say this series, it's not a series, in this, or on this, or for this little project of mine, this Simpa Life Podcast. Thank you very much if you are still tuning in from episode 1. It has been a hell of a journey. Next week, come 100 and many, many more. This week's guest is somebody that I'm surprised I haven't had on previously. I don't quite know how. Really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have here. I think there is a great deal of synergy and sort of intersectionality between what we do and our worldviews. And I think, I really want to get straight into this. So I'm not going to bore you with some shitty little anecdote and then we'll segue into it. So we're just going to jump straight into this one. So today's guest is the founder and CEO of Unyte Hemp. They are the executive chair of the Cannabis Industry Council in the UK and the technical advisor to the APPG, which is the All-Party Parliamentary Group, quite a mouthful, on CBD here in the UK. They are Jamie Bartley. How are you doing, brother?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Simpa, and thanks for having me.
No worries, no worries. Like I said, it's odd that I kind of haven't had you on previously, but I think there's still quite a few people quite close within the network that we all sort of work in that I just haven't had time to, very busy in different projects. But yeah, definitely really glad to be having this one today. So I suppose let's jump straight into it. And for the people that don't know you, can kind of give us a bit of background as to how you got involved in cannabis or with cannabis sativa L?
Yep, certainly. So I initially started looking at cannabis sativa hemp, which I know we'll certainly go into a bit of conversation around the terminology. But it was around probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It was to do with actually contaminated land remediation. I'd spent 15 years working in construction and in waste management and specialising in brownfield regeneration and remediation. And and when I started looking and researching, they'd actually used hemp quite a lot around Chernobyl, and there'd been a big research study done in Italy as well, cleaning up some chromium-6, some heavy metal contamination caused by industrial metal works, and it had impacted on 50 hectares of farmland and meant that that land couldn't be used for arable crop production because it would get absorbed by the crops and therefore would affect humans if we ate that, or animals. So they grew hemp on it for 3 years and actually cleaned it up enough to go back into arable crop. So that was my initial sort of touch point. But when I started research around the crop, and I actually realised, wow, this can really be a solution for so many of the problems that were, if you like, coming to public perception, things like microplastics and climate change as a whole, the impact of sort of petrochemical industries and how carbon cycle was really coming to fruition. COP26 was sort of down the road a bit, but still on the horizon. And I really saw that actually there's a lot of reasons why this crop can be the solution to so many different problems that we're trying to solve again. And really, it was through the prohibition that it hasn't been that solution. That was the main reason for prohibition in the first place. So that was really my journey with it. And we formed the group back in 2018, myself and business partner Craig, and really looked at trying to utilise all aspects of cannabis and hemp, and really focused on improving both the environment and improving human health as much as possible. And it's been a quite a journey there. Obviously, trying to start a group of startup companies during just prior to COVID, etc., was not without its headaches, but we've managed to sort of keep it going in the right direction. We've not taken any external investment to date, and we've really just sort of self-generated a lot of the research we've done. I wasn't confident around trying to scale sort of a large scale production facilities for hemp products without having a lot of more robust data than we had. So I took the decision, rather than relying on some Chinese and some Canadian data that wasn't that relevant to the UK. We grew 240 acres for 3 years in a row, growing 5 different cultivars at 11 different seed densities, and just made sure we generate as much robust data, how all those variables impacted on the fibers, the shivs, the seed concentration, the cannabinoid concentration, just so we had as much accurate data that we could rely on from a UK perspective. So if we are going to go and grow 32,000 acres per facility, which is what our target is for our initial end products that we're going to try and launch, we need to know how much we are actually going to be able to produce and how much different blocks or insulation that's going to make. So now we've generated that data. We spent a lot of money to generate it, but it gives us real confidence in scaling the whole business plan.
Sorry, I'm just going to turn down my mic because I think the feedback there is quite heavy. Yeah, hopefully that'll be all right. Yeah, excellent. I kind of vaguely knew some of that from previous conversations, but I didn't know that you've transitioned from from an area where there are these external problems. You've then obviously found that there is this sort of solution, and you're moving into this space. And I think that few people are kind of doing that. A lot of people are jumping into cannabis to make money. They are jumping into it to exploit it. Obviously, some people have sort of a passion for it, but it's interesting that you have sort of a direct focus and sort of niche within what you're seeking to do with it. And it's brilliant that you are highlighting it, because for all, obviously, yeah, we'll move on to why I disagree with the word hemp, and we'll have that conversation shortly. But in terms of reminding people and showing them the potential of cannabis as a commercial and industrial resource, especially in building and for bioremediation, I mean, that's a conversation a lot of the adult consumption market don't want to have, because they don't want to have to remind consumers that the soil, the products that they're growing, that they're combusting or consuming, could be full of some very destructive and dangerous things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's what they call a a hyperaccumulator. So when you use it for remediation, it's called a phytoremedial crop because it's a plant and it can remediate soils. But the hyperaccumulator bit means that it can absorb far higher levels of things like zinc or arsenic, different metals that could potentially be present in soils, and still grow and therefore still produce flowers and still go into the consumption chains, etc. So certainly there's a risk there, and that goes across all types of cannabis.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, let's jump straight into this language thing, because then any other question I want to ask is basically going to circle back to this sort of anyway. Obviously, I've been sat as an annoying little northerner in the crowd a few times when I've seen you speak, and shot my hand in the air whenever I've heard hemp this and hemp that. And you often, in fact, most often, the only voice on a panel that then agrees with me. Everyone else gets a little bit defensive and a bit sort of you're trapped within their interpretation, their knowledge base, and they're defensive of it. I understand that. Whereas yourself has been quite acceptant of this, that it is all sort of cannabis. I understand why hemp needs to be sort of utilized in certain spheres, because it doesn't elicit sort of a scared or fearful reaction from policymakers, governments, etc., and general non-consumers. But it also creates this false dichotomy, not intentionally, I don't believe, or perhaps initially when it was diverged a century ago or so. The point of this, or rather, not the point of it, but its consequence of what is happening is creating this false dichotomy, this false binary, that hemp does all these wonderful things, but cannabis can't. Cannabis is only the drug, it's only the consumable, but hemp produces flowers. You can then smoke those CBD flowers as well, the CBD rich, because obviously hemp is defined as the cultivars within a region that is below that certain arbitrary level of THC. So within the UK, it's 0.2, America, it's 0.3, Italy, 0.6, Switzerland, what is it, 1? And obviously, this is trying to control a plant and keep it within that restraint. When actually, when most people use the word hemp, they mean the materials, the byproducts of it. So the building materials, the plastics that you can make, paper, string, fuels, graphene, etc. So this is the thing I'm rebelling against, is I'm trying to it not be lost to us that then, okay, yeah, if hemp you can do this and cannabis you can do that. It's like, well, with the same plant, you can get all that resin, all of the flowers and the narcotic drug properties with all of those building properties,
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is, and you're right. I mean, the terminology was really used to try and force that messaging and force that diversion around the good parts and the bad parts of ultimately one and the same. And I mean, I'm a big believer that it's botanical name, it's cannabis sativa L. Let's look at that. And as we've often conversed around, it's how you apply different uses. So it could be an industrial application of the cannabis plant. It can be a medicinal application of the cannabis plant. It can be a well-being application. It can be a food application. There's so many different applications, but we definitely have that divergence, and people do absolutely react, certainly from outside the sector, far softer to the word hemp. But even that, you still get an instant reaction from a lot of people that it's a hippie thing. It's that it still has that attraction to it, and that's again been stigmatized because to really portray that, to keep it sort of pushed down and keep it keep it prevented from really being the actual resource it can be. And I mean, I quite often talk to, I mean, there's a prime example going back 3 or 4 years now, and there was a chief exec from the local council and there was a local MP, and they were both at one of these networking type events. And I went along, listened to what they had to say as a bit of an update, and I caught them both at the same time afterwards. I was like, gents, can I just talk to you about a few things here? I want to talk to you about enabling the UK agricultural sector to decarbonise, providing sustainable jobs locally and levelling up local economies, providing carbon negative construction materials, providing food for our both for our animal populations and our human populations as carbon negative, while improving following crop yields, all without pesticides, insecticides. And at the end of it all, like, oh, this is great. Can you come and tell come and tell our members more and all this? I was like, yeah, no problem at all. But do you want to know what I was talking about? And you could see them both go, oh, I don't know. What was he actually talking about? I said, what I was talking about was cannabis sativa L, which is also industrial hemp. But if I'd have come over and said to you, can I talk to you about cannabis? You'd have shut the conversation down straight away. And one of the biggest barriers to actually achieving the solutions it can achieve is people's instant connotation to the word still. So if we lead with the solutions, they oversee the word, and then by the time they realise what the word is you're talking about, they're probably quite brought into it. And that's sort of, I think, is we're always going to, unfortunately, we live in that generation where we're always going to be surrounded by people who have a negative instant reaction to the word. And all we can try and do is break that instant reaction and prohibition rhetoric that's been drummed into their mindsets down with evidence and science-based facts. And ultimately, it'll be a long slog, but each person you can educate is one less person that will have that negative reaction to the words.
Yeah, very, very true. And it is like, it's the same with when people say, oh, CBD, and CBD has been so abstracted from cannabis now that most people are like, oh yeah, I buy CBD in the high street, but don't touch cannabis. Cannabis is bad, it's dangerous.
Cannabinoids.
Yeah, so it's so abstract. And what, again, either consequentially or intentionally this has led to is a narrowing of access and a restriction on what people can say around it and the information they can give. So the consumers are consuming blind. They don't know they're consuming cannabis. They don't know they're potentially consuming cannabinoids that could in a way fail a drug test. They could get their license suspended. There's a lot to sort of cover there. And this has then resulted in things like, what is it? Or the Peels, that company in America launched by a former basketball player, and they're synthesizing CBD from orange peel. There's a way to produce it from byproduct of yeast extract as well. Obviously, there's then all of the biosyntheses and chemistry that can be occurred to change all of the biomass of cannabinoids as well. There's some of the basic chemistry there as well. I say basic, quite basic for the people who know what they're doing, to be able to produce just an isolate CBD. And this is not necessarily what the market wants. So then people fall back into cannabis. And then we're seeing the same around people that are looking for air quotes, smokable hemp. And so what they're trying to say here is they want low THC cannabis, which is actually quite an irony in that the so-called hemp farmers here in the UK, they get a low THC cannabis license. So we understand why the term is used more colloquially than it is academically, because we're now starting to see a broadening of our understanding. So I'm currently delving into research at the minute around Balochistan and sort of Pakistan, Afghanistan, that kind of region. And so they're doing studies they're breaking it down to broadleaf type, narrowleaf type, drug type. But they're trying to stay away from this sort of hemp type, because you end up with, and so are other few people, because we end up with this confusion. Western hemp versus Eastern hemp are almost antithetical. An Eastern hemp plant or what they would consider a hemp plant, will have a higher THC profile. It will have a different terpenoid profile than what we would expect to see in the West. So we trying to create consensus science across the world, and people are interchangeably using these terms. If you then got, Biden stood up going, marijuana, and they've got, we've got a hemp act, and it's like, neither of those things are cannabis. In your law, you're going to have to write the word cannabis sativa L. You're going to have to, because you have to regulate the thing that exists. Fully have the bolster and the public sort of discourse around it. They still have to use the scientific term when it comes to legislation. So it seems that there's just this middle bit where there is the information, but because it's profitable to not speak of it, it seems that there's a few camps So there's people that use hemp that are trying not to offend people like yourself, and that are trying, not necessarily just the reason, but are trying to get those wider conversations, break out of the echo chambers that we have around the cannabis community, culture, and industry into other diverse areas. Then you've got the people who are trying to profit from it and then going, ha, as long as we say this is hemp and we say all of these things and never say that word and never use that leaf, and we can make money from it. And 9 times out of 10, those boys want to be in that market anyway. They just figure it's the best way to get into it at the end of the day. And then you've got the people in the middle that are just, they're almost, I don't say archaic, but they're looking at it in an older way, and they're defending sort of almost a druid kind of pagan like relationship with hemp that they call hemp. But even that, the hemp that they had present then was cannabis by our modern connotations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what grew here was in the UK prior to prohibition and eradication was 6% THC. That's what naturally grew here. So that was our original hemp, if you like, prior to eradication. So it shows what grows most stably here without human influence. So therefore, that's ideally what we should be growing as crops in the field, because it's going to still be the most stable crop. I mean, one of the issues at the moment around THC is that as we're experiencing hotter and hotter summers, that risk of, if we get a load of 40 plus degree temperatures like we did this year in a row, that's going to stress the crops, and the crops are going to, what traditionally would have been way below 0.2% THC, can easily test way over 0.2% THC just due to climate change. So, I mean, from both the CIC and the APPG side of things, we're pushing for it should really be 1% in the fields, because that's then de-risks it for farmers growing it. Because, okay, ideally we don't have licensing longer term at all, but we're in a position at the moment because of Misuse of Drugs Act. Till that changes, we need a exemption from Misuse of Drugs Act to grow cannabis, which is what it, as you said, rightfully said, that's what it's termed on the license. It's low THC cannabis, and there is no differentiation in MODA around any THC level. It's all cannabis as far as MODA is concerned. So there is ways that they can quite easily change some of those pieces with just changing the Home Office guidance, for instance, around the THC limits, or even using the flower and leaves in the UK. At the moment, the farmers have to destroy the flowers and leaves, when actually all of the CBD, that's whatever it is, 690, 700 million CBD industry in the UK now, all of that's imported from Europe and from the US or from China, when we could be producing that domestically. It won't ever be a massive volume of area and cultivation size. I did the maths a few years ago, and it was about 640 acres. If you grew it and extracted the biomass, would provide enough raw extract for the whole CBD industry for a year in the UK. So it's not going to be a massive acreage end use, but it's obviously a value. And if we could produce that from the UK, why wouldn't you do that? It's a bit of a non-brainer economically if you don't. But certainly, even if it was allowing the farmers to use the flowers and the leaves for animal feed, for bioethanol production, for bioplastics, for anaerobic digestion, for energy, those are all volume sectors that we should and could be using the cannabis plant for, but are currently off the cards because of the guidance in the licensing policy.
Mm. Yeah, exactly that. So this sort of leads us on to then a question or a point that I've been trying to sort of make, that these subdivisions, these artificial binaries that we're creating within this, of saying, well, this does this, but that then doesn't, it is really massively hampering us. We spoke then before of kind of you spoke of, sorry, of the two officials that you had that conversation with, and you led with its potential and what it can do before saying what it was. And what I think those people in that position need to realize is it's their ignorance is the linchpin. They are the finger in the dam holding back the deluge from this potential future. It's that, if cannabis is cannabis and cannabis can do this, but cannabis is also this, we regulate this and sell all of the cannabis that they're making billions off in the UK anyway, we have all of the biomass material of that. You're saying that makes homes that are flame resistant, that are mold resistant, pest resistant, moisture resistant. They're thermally self-regulating. It's just like, wait, what? You know what I mean? If we can just get them to understand and look down the scope of this and actually accept it all in one conversation, because you're right. If they were allowed to extract from the plants, because obviously, I mean, everyone remembers the famous case a few years ago with hemp, and it's a £250,000 crop they had to destroy. And it's ridiculous. It's why destroy it? The plant didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, they can't extract it for the CBD, but the biomass, the material was still there. It still sequestered that carbon. If they went off and fucking burned it, you're just pissing that carbon back in the atmosphere. What was the point of it? Whereas these things can be utilized. Again, research needs to be massively opened up. And if the plants can explore their potential, because again, we don't necessarily have landrace genetics here in the UK, but what we do have is a potential to work backwards through wilded plants here to understand what settled here and exactly that, find out what was the hemp of ye olde before we unified it under Carl Linnaeus and sativa, Cannabis sativa as the collective genus name. So there's a lot to really understand here, but it seems that some of the work that's in the direction to help air quotes hemp, to help air quotes the medicinal cannabis industrial complex, as I'm terming it, seems to be leaving behind cannabis. Yet cannabis is still sat here going, well, actually, if in those fields you grew cannabis, not hemp, as it were, over the arbitrary limit, we know the root density massively increases, the biomass increases, the immune systems of the plants increase, the spectrum of which the terpenoid profiles can express, and its adaptability to that environment. So then, as we're seeing with climate change now, in various regions of the world, places that used to be drought ridden now starting to have a lot of moisture. Cannabis is going to be one of the first wild plants in those regions that adapts to it. We need to use that adaptogen ability of the plants as a resource. And at the minute, as you say, we're just pissing in the wind, frankly, in a lot of ways, as I feel with it, which isn't to obviously lessen any of the work that you're doing. So now, tell me how we're not pissing in the wind with the various projects you're involved in. So I'm not being a Debbie Downer, but there you go. No pressure. Save me. Tell me where I'm going wrong here.
No, I think there is, and often I think it's hard to see sometimes when you're fighting that fight daily sort of thing. But I do think there's a change coming, certainly from some of the conversations I was trying to have with people from Bays, for instance, around construction materials from hemp and how that can really be scaled as well. 3-4 years ago, getting nowhere really, and then sort of a couple of years ago, suddenly we saw a massive upturn in construction costs and global supply chains were impacted. COVID had a still dragging on impact on that worldwide supply chain that sort of UK construction thrives off generally. And suddenly then they were all banging on the door. Can we talk about this? This sounds like quite a sensible idea now, because it's a no-brainer in my eyes. It produces 4 times the biomass that forestry does. So as a biomass source, we need volume, and we've got 4.8 million arable acres of land in the UK. So it's a scalable biomass source. You can take food from the same crop. You can produce further increase in yields, 16 to 18% in the following crops. So it improves food security by having a crop rotation. Get all the carbon sequestration benefits of it, 25 times the CO2 that the same size area rainforest will sequester in 4 months. And you get the biodiversity benefit because it's a late season source of pollen for our bees and pollinators. And you don't need any pesticides, insecticides, you need very little fertilizers on most soils. So there's not many reasons why it doesn't make sense as a source of biomass. And I mean, at the current, the UK government's sort of perspective on sustainable insulation, for instance, is we'll use wood fibre insulation. Well, if we did 10% of the UK's annual insulation usage, just 10% in 1 year, the first year we cut down 50% of the UK's forests. We want to do another 10% the following year, we've cut down the other 50% of the UK's forest. And we've got to wait 28 years for that biomass to regrow again. Whereas with the arable acres of land and the volumes that it produces, it is the source of biomass that we need if we want to give something like construction, which emits 40% of our carbon emissions just from that sector. If we want to give them any realistic chance of decarbonising, they need volume, scale delivery of alternate bio-based materials, which is what we're trying to provide. So I think it's getting there now. The sort of the plan is there. The big barrier though is for any of these end uses is the levels of capital investment needed to build the infrastructure. I mean, each facility we're looking to build out, we need 60 million worth of capex and opex per facility. We need 20 acres of buildings in total. 4 acres of buildings will be purely manufacturing, 16 acres of storage and curing capacity. It's going to need 32,000 acres a year as a feedstock, and we're looking to build 5 of them out around the UK. But we need to close a hell of a lot of money to do that, and once we do that, we'll still only be producing 10% of the UK's annual insulation usage. but each of those facilities will produce enough insulation to insulate 10,600 houses a year and produce 5 million hempcrete blocks. So we can actually then go and start building at scale with bio-based alternate materials and suddenly turn that massive juggernaut of a construction industry in the right direction. But that's just one sector: green hydrogen, bioethanol, or other areas that we're doing a lot of work on that I think, again, as sustainable fuel sources absolutely make a lot of sense and are coming to fruition now. So if we can combine being able to produce carbon negative construction materials for new build and for retrofit, there's 27 million houses in the UK that need retrofitting. So why retrofit them with high embodied carbon products like PIR and different insulation materials, rockwood, etc., when we can use something that's carbon negative and lock that carbon up out the atmosphere long term into those buildings, removing it not fully permanently but semi-permanently from the carbon cycle. So I think it's getting there. I think the CIC's had a lot of sort of good traction, and I think it's been very successful in sort of unifying different elements. And to your point around the different sectors and interests within the industries, if you like, I think that the CIC seems to be doing quite a good representation of pulling together that and stopping some of the infighting that we experienced over quite a few years from different political parties in the industry, that also then from the 99.9% of the UK that's not in the industry, just if they did go and have a look at it, we were like, oh, this doesn't look like it's ready to have a conversation about anything sensible. I do feel now we're starting to break those barriers down. There's a lot more valid conversations going on with, and I mean, I'm not a massive fan of being in and around politics, but the only way we're going to change any of it is being in and around and having conversations with different politicians and with different government departments to try and ensure we do get sensible change. And that's really what I've spent a lot of focus trying to do over the last couple of years, is just try and ensure that we're having sensible, relevant conversations they're also cross-sectoral as well. And I'm a big believer, as you can see from the way we set the Unyte group up, it's quite diverse, but it does focus on all elements, if you like, of the sectors. And I think rather than having a lot of people do just have their focus on whether it be a medicinal cannabis entity or whether it be a CBD brand or whether it be a hemp end use. But I've always sort of been a big believer it's about the whole plant and everything the plant can offer. So therefore, we should represent all of those different options and sectors and make sure that one voice doesn't outshine the others. Otherwise, what you end up getting, as we've seen in certain jurisdictions, I mean, the Isle of Man's quite a good example. There was I worked fairly closely with the government when they were rolling out the legislation there, and I was over on the island for the public vote, and the public vote voted in favour. It was 97% in favour of accessing medicinal cannabis. What they actually got delivered was a framework for cannabinoids, not necessarily a cannabis framework. So you can't have a male plant on the island. So any of your industrial applications of cannabis are a non-starter there. But it has got a very useful, commercially sensible, cannabinoid-centric framework that's been put in place there for the production of cannabis for cannabinoids and for extraction. So that has ticked that box, and that is quite a viable option over there. So I think it's about, I would have liked to have seen the industrial applications over there as well. There's no reason you can't. There's some concerns about cross-pollination from industrial crops that could impact on medicinal crops or CBD crops, etc. But you've got about a 5 kilometre downwind and about a 0.5 kilometre upwind risk zone around a hemp crop cross-pollinating other female crops in a field. So, I mean, there's a way of zoning that carefully through licensing and not having any risk issues at all. But we'll probably see a 2.0 framework over there at some point, and then we'll get some of the industrial applications. So I think overall we're seeing it globally, and I think we are starting to see it in the UK, that there's some conversations being had. I won't go into too much of my personal thoughts on the current set, but yeah, we've just got to keep being there and keep offering sensible conversation, and then bit by bit, hopefully, we do get to see the changes that we're all looking for.
Yeah, you feel me, a little bit of optimism there, so that's a good thing. And re-energized me for the rest of this podcast, because I kind of just ranted myself into a hole there. But no, I think, yeah, you're right. It's we're now looking at it basically. We're just missing what, tiles, I think, and then we've got an entire house. We've got tiles. There you go. So then you've got timbers, we've got bricks, you've got insulation. Are you doing any research around sort of graphene? Because obviously graphene, in terms of its tensile strength, is massive, but in terms of its energy conductive abilities as well. Yeah,
we've done some. Terming it HBC, hemp biochar. So we've done some trials already. Stage 1. It's using technology called pyrolysis. So that's it's an energy technology where you heat materials up to around 800 degrees Celsius, but you do it in a zero oxygen environment, and then that produces a very stable carbon format, which is a char, which is in essence is a graphene. So it stabilizes the carbon molecules. So, and then we're looking at multiple different end use options for biochar for the HBC. So that could be used for anything from activating compost and using it for a soil improver in an agricultural setting, or even in a more domestic setting. But equally, when you add the HBC to concrete, you improve the strength of the concrete and you reduce the volume of concrete needed. So you decarbonise the concrete in 2 or 3 different ways by adding the HBC to it, and you also lock that carbon into the concrete for the duration of the concrete. So they've just poured a slab on HS2 recently that's one of the first structural slabs to have no rebar reinforcing in it, which has got graphene in there basically to add the structural strength, which is exactly the applications we're looking to perform for the HBC. The bit we haven't done at the moment is looking at energy density. Obviously, there's been some work done on it. Robert Midland did some work over in the US a few years ago and shown absolutely the viability of hemp graphene basically to be used in energy storage as a battery storage solution. So I do think there's some further works to be done there, but it isn't something that we've personally undertaken any direct work on at the moment. It's something that's absolutely on the list, but the danger with it is that you can spend so much time talking about the potential and the end use potential and not actually do any of it. I mean, the number of meetings I was in early doors where we'd sit down to talk about X and Y end uses, and we'd spend 3 hours going off all different other tangents that were all absolutely viable, but you've got to get on and do something. And once you've got some at scale being produced, you can spend all the rest of your time doing your further R&D into the other areas. But the reason we focused on construction, as I said earlier, it's a massive emitter of carbon. It's a big end use sector that I've worked in for 15 years anyway, so I've got a good understanding of the sector across sort of large infrastructure development, and I know that they need scale. So those are the main reasons, which means we can have the impact on the volume of carbon that we're addressing, and that's really the goal, is address as much carbon in as quickly time as possible. And you get a double bubble, because not only does construction emit lots of carbon, but the materials within construction have huge carbon emissions as well. So you get a double bubble when you then replace them with carbon negative materials that are actually going to lock carbon up into those built materials.
Yeah, exactly that. It's yet another one of those reasons why I'm just going to term them ignorant authorities as a catch-all term. That they're going on about, we're going to create carbon credits and we're going to do this and this and we're tackling climate. It's like, cannabis is one of the best, if not the best, natural carbon sequestration technology that we have. It seems to me that guys like yourself, that, we want to build these facilities. Why the fuck there isn't government investment? And I'm going, actually, any bit of land that we've got everywhere, grow low THC cannabis all over it, and then just give it to guys like yourself and then figure that shit out after the fact. Because it's quite cheap to produce en masse, considering the end potential of it compared to a hell of a lot of other agricultural crops, and it doesn't need the intensive farming that we see from basically anything else that we have naturalized here in this country, and it doesn't do the harm of monocrops. So there, as you say, there are so many different benefits here, and it is that it seems to me it is entirely it's people like me that does the damage to them in their eyes. It's the druggies, the smokers, the consumers, the weed heads, and it's they can't see past that, and it's just so blinding. They'd let the world burn, their children choke and starve, than accidentally let a couple of potheads out loose in the world so that we could revolutionize every industry that is out there. Because you see, it's not just construction, fast fashion. is one of the largest polluters across the world. When you start to really look at the practices that go off in India, in China, in Bangladesh, Jesus fuck me Christ, what they are doing to the environment. Yeah, if we could then introduce them to this resource, because cannabis for clearing waterways as well, that is something, again, we're not talking about in this country. The Tories have just pumped how many gallons of shit into our waterways. And yet cannabis roots, we know that cannabis growing along riverways purifies that water. We know that it helps promote biodiversity. We know also that it promotes mycelium diversity in soils as well. So microbiology is then massively improved with this as well. So it's just, there's a bajillion, gazillion benefits, and there's some guy that wants to smoke a joint. And yet we're ignorant for what here? Why are we at fault? This is what I don't get. And it's one of the things I have an internal conflict of, that yes, to the grannies, me walking down the street with me joint or whatever, intimidating, druggy, you know, or the thug, hold my handbag close. I can understand why they're being indoctrinated into that worldview. But I am not going to then change the expression of my identity to serve their comfort. I'm in a position now where I'm basically fighting for cannabis and drug rights, and that is the same or analogous to LGBTQ plus rights, in my opinion. I am high, I'm here, get fucking used to it. But I can see all these other potentials, and I'm trying to speak of them. Yet most people, I try to do your rhetorical trick and try not to mention it till last, but they can smell me coming. They can see me. They can feel it. Do you know what I mean? I'm already there. I can't quite hide it to them. So yeah, it's in all quarters we need these conversations, and it's the more we can do to get out of this echo chamber, because it frustrates me, even that the number of people in, I don't want to say my side of the fence, because I don't believe in the bloody fence, but where we're corralled over here as recreational adult consumers, most of us don't care about anything else out there, because we're still at war. We can't think of, oh, the bioremedial property. Yeah, the cops are coming. They're going to kick my door in. You know, that gang around the corner that I've been selling on their turf, they're going to come cut me up. You know what I mean? I owe this dealer for an ounce. I ticked on and I got pulled over. I'm losing my license. I'll lose my job. My kids again. Do you know what I mean? There's still that mentality. And so I bridge kind of both worlds. And one of the things I try and be mindful of in conversations with people like yourself is how do we promote more synergy? How do we promote more intersectionality, crossover between our movements? Because I believe that that's still a powerful argument, that if you win the human rights argument to break open the corral and let the people free, that everyone else that's involved in this conversation benefits. And
Oh, 100%. It unlocks,
as well.
It unlocks all the other pieces as well, doesn't it? I mean, that's the bottom line, Simpa. If the prohibition piece is the reason that there's so many different barriers and terminologies and requirements, it all stems back to the original piece around the prohibition of a plant in the first place. And ultimately that prohibition was led predominantly by the benefits that plant can produce for different sectors that are now looking back at it, go, right, we need this as a solution. Now let's have a look at it. That like you said, the fast fashion. I mean, DuPont had just patented nylon and heavily invested in petrochemicals, and that didn't really work for them. When you've got a natural fiber crop that can produce lots of volumes of fibers, and also happen to produce flowers that were being consumed medicinally, and happen to produce volumes of biomass that were used for lots of different things, it just doesn't work. It didn't work for big pharma, it didn't work for big oil, and it didn't work for big forestry. And those were the elements that really sort of, obviously, as you well know, push prohibition forwards. And I think to your point, and how do we unlock that? It's through collaboration of all of those different entities in the sector to really sort of push back and provide the solutions to those different industries that are now trying to get back to it again. Because I think they realise now there is a real awareness that things have got to change with regards to environmental and sustainability wise, and the only reason we do that is, or way we do that, is become back to our nature-based solutions that have been there for thousands of years. Hemp was a solution, cannabis was a solution to humanity for lots of different things. We've unfortunately lived in a 100-year blip of prohibition where it hasn't been treated with the same way. And if the likes of ourselves get it right, between us, we'll unlock that for the future thousands and thousands of years, and they'll be able to utilise it as a solution as it should be, in whichever way people want to apply the plant to their own lives or to their own businesses.
Exactly that, and that's where my stance for. I'm still nitpicking here and there within the community and industry, as I seem to do, as the role I've inherited or been birthed into, it would feel. I'm for liberation, truly for liberation, because I believe that once they can't use the fact that some people like to get high as the cost to beat us, the entirety of the plant breaks open. It's once the research gets out there. I mean, even the stuff that we know collectively, that, you know, as a community, as passionate connoisseurs, so that we share this information and knowledge, that's still a few pages into that book, you know, and the rest of the book was burnt in the time of history, but we can rewrite it, we're rediscovering it, but it requires the freedom and the space to do that research. And there are places around the world that are getting ahead of it, and it's a shame because the research is disappearing off into, you know, boardrooms and laboratories, and it's not being published out to the public. And so the governments are then not getting the information, so they're looking over at Colorado and Washington and California and places like that, and all they're looking at is the money and the revenue. They're not seeing the social good, they're not seeing the environmental good, they're not seeing the benefit. You spoke with the bees before. Yeah, there was one study a few years ago in Colorado that found, I think, 23 different subspecies of bee that benefit from the late season pollen, and it's an insanity. So we've literally got this huge thing of save the bees, we've got this huge thing of like tackle atmospheric carbon, this huge thing of, oh, we've got petrochemicals in this, we've got fertilizers in this and this, again, all down to that same fucking solution. And it's, as you spoke of before, it's weird that the blip is that, yeah, everything was kind of not necessarily hunky-dory. We had a fuck ton of war, a hell of a lot of barbary and people going around and just killing others because you worship the wrong rock or whatever. But we didn't have these mass industries that were leading us towards potential extinction events. I mean, what is it? In the past 50 years, we've lost 60 years, we've lost 50% of the animal species on the world, which is in fucking sanity. And again, it comes back to we have to tackle, and we're looking at like a jigsaw, and we've got it upside down, and we're missing the box, and the box in the front of it has got a giant picture of cannabis, and every piece we overturn has got weed on it. Oh, not that piece. Oh, not that piece. And they're just going through it all, trying to find something that isn't cannabis as a solution to the problems, and they're not going to get there. And every generation they dawdle and go, I don't know if this is going to be a vote winner. Should we do this? I mean, even like Biden's announcement was not necessarily hollow, but was very sort of symbolic, was very just empty. It was, oh, we want to do something about these marijuana people and racial disparities. And it was like, well, firstly, don't say marijuana if you want to talk about racial disparities, but then actually do something meaningful. There are so few people that are then going to actually get benefit from this announcement. Yeah, it was 6 weeks before the midterm, so it might work well for their election. Then what? They've got 2 years to do what? Should we do it now? Should we do it now? Or wait till 2 months before the next one and then promise them again? How many more people are going to suffer? How many more people are going to die from illnesses that could be treated with cannabis? How much more atmospheric carbon? How many more climate catastrophes are we going to see? Like 2/3 of Pakistan flooded recently. Do you know the entirety of all of those regions where we're seeing these floods? Do you know we used to grow there in ginormous volumes, tens of millions of plants with huge roots that went down and held the land together? I think it was cannabis. It's a cause of, like, cannabis prohibition is the cause of, and cannabis is the solution to the majority, if not all, of human ills. And that's not me saying to go and smoke a joint, because that'll help as well. But in all of these different capacities, and it's frustrating and almost like, I think it's maddening to a point of most people, their cognitive dissonance is that giant barrier, and they know it to be true, and they know these things, but for their own sanity, they can't hold these things in their mind at the same time, because otherwise we just go and burn the system down.
Yeah. I think we will get it there. I mean, I think there is definitely things move slowly. I mean, I think I've been in a meeting with one of the ladies who's drafting the federal legislation, and I mean it is coming. Whether it happens in the next 2 years, maybe not. And absolutely, I mean it is too slow. Should have happened 10 years ago. But I think the key is, as long as we do keep the pressure on and there is movement, then I think bit by bit. I mean, Germany will be quite a big step forwards, I think, potentially for Europe. Speaking to a few different people across different European states, there's definitely some movements there. And I think from a UK perspective, we're going to be taking chance and taking the Brexit opportunity with both hands. Well, there's a perfect opportunity to move quicker than Europe does. I mean, the big question mark for Germany will be, once Germany draft legislation, which they won't call draft legislation, they'll call it like a white paper on policy or something, because there'll be a little bit of a game there. I think you won't see it called a draft legislation. and that will go in front of the European Commission, and the European Commission then have to decide. So that's going to be a big sort of next stage milestone or not. So is whether the European Commission sign off on what's proposed from Germany. But I do think if Germany get it right and move forwards, and certainly some of the bits I've been seeing with regards to what they're looking to do with regards to allowing certain number of plants at home, that kind of thing, I think that's quite an important piece to enable both the non-industrial commercialisation of a sector, and ensure that ultimately people don't get forced to go out and spend money on something that they could be producing themselves in their own control to their own sort of preferred sort of endpoint. So I think hopefully that could be some steps forwards. Be nice to see something similar. I hear rumblings we've got licensing reviews going on in the next few little while, so what we'll see comes out. I mean, there's certainly a lot more conversations going on now across different departments UK wise as well, than were previously. I think we'll see the APPG that's going to sort of rename as such to industrial APPG for industrial cannabis, to broaden the scope to include.
I'm glad it's cannabis, not hemp. I appreciate that.
I was pushing for that.
Good man, good man.
So yeah, so I think that's gonna probably happen later, or some point before Christmas. So I think these things are all sort of moving. None of it's as quick as I'd like to see it moving, but I think the key is as long as it is moving and it's not just stagnated, then we will eventually get to what we want to see, which is, like I say, liberation, ultimately.
Yeah, man. Yeah, for sure. So, for the people that may not be aware, what is the APPG, formerly on CBD, soon to be on industrial cannabis?
So APPGs are formed when you've got cross-party different officers, MPs, and they form an APPG because it's got a specific focus area. They normally have a secretariat that would be sort of some form of industry, something to do with that industry as such. And then the secretariat sort of formed an advisory board. So we're basically, there's various different entities, and we all sit on there as I represent the CIC on there with Mike, the CIC's CEO. And basically the idea is that it's to ensure that whatever's put forwards is what the industry as a whole is looking for ultimately. So these different MPs from both Parliament and the House of Lords as well, that attend various meetings, and then they usually get presentations from different people. So the lady who was drafting the federal legislation came over from the US to do a presentation at one point. There's been some involvement with some of the chaps from some of the Channel Islands. So there's been different presentations put forward by different people, and it's really around looking at elements that affect the sector. And off the back of the initial meetings, there was a business plan that was released just before the summer recess of Parliament that really shows cross-sectoral across both medicinal cannabis, hemp, CBD, wellness products, industrial cannabis, industrial hemp, and adult use, social use, recreational, call it what you want. Those 4 different areas, what potentially, if 27 different legislative changes were addressed, what that means in a taxes and in a job creation point of view. Is 5.5 billion in taxes, and it's 500,000 jobs created overnight. Now, obviously, some of those are things that would need primary legislation changes, and I think from the last conversations I had, the House of Lords is pretty much full for the next 12 months. So unless the Prime Minister drops a load of legislation out, which could easily happen, the new team could easily pull a lot of the stuff that's waiting to go through. But at the moment, you'd be looking at least 12 months to 18 months for a primary legislative change to something like Misuse of Drugs Act, for instance. But there are other things in there that absolutely don't need legislative changes, that are just guidance and around licensing, as we said, around using the flower and the leaf. I mean, they're concerned, and it frustrates me because I think anyone that understands the sectors really knows that it's not a risk. But the main reason that is the concern around flowers and leaves and the licensing is that they feel that those flowers and leaves on the plants behind me that are full of seeds would have a benefit or a sort of value to the black market, and that's one of their main sort of fear factors around the hemp license at the moment, is that these flowers are going to have a value in the black market. But obviously, anyone who understands any of the sectors will understand that a flower full of seeds, if it's a hemp flower or not hemp flower, any cannabis flower full of seeds isn't going to have a value in any market as such if it's for a smoking consumption vaping type market. So I think it's just again, it's that trying to get the right educational pieces over to them, and that sort of gives the APPG gives an opportunity to try and have those conversations and engage and lobby with the various different people that ultimately are going to need to be the ones that say yes, this change needs to be made or that change needs to be made.
Awesome. Yeah, good breakdown. Good breakdown. I'm sure some of my audience that are not aware of sort of how the process works will be grateful for that. You mentioned sort of Germany briefly. It's something from sort of glancery insight. Obviously, they've not, as far as I'm aware, officially released, although there was a leak suggesting they were looking at somewhere between 20-30 grams personal consumption. What was it, 2 plants grown at home, and dispensary model potentially with social consumption spaces. Which I think, again, as much as we all know these things are all first draft, these are not what will be the forever legislation of and the day-to-day experience of the people living in these regions, as we've seen from other areas. But it just kind of, it re-emphasizes this kind of European attitude that the cannabis consumer shouldn't be involved in this, that we're there to buy the product at the end of it. So they set it up dependent on what is best for them, for how it'll impact other industries, other aspects of life, criminality, socioeconomic factors, etc. They don't want to disrupt any of those things. They want to minimize it and go, all right, well, if we profit from it and we control it and we sell it and they buy it, that's cool. So I worry that may end up getting stepped back, not forward, in Germany in its first draft, and what's happening at the European level in terms of the European Commission, they're already working on something. They're already planning their own, and that's got to be something that is acceptable by the other member states. Yet we've seen other member states try and pop up. We saw Luxembourg a few years ago tried to go kind of ahead of the curve. Obviously, France has actually gone more the opposite way, but is getting kind of kicked down by the European Commission. But a few other regions are looking at this. Italy was kind of nearly going to be potentially forced by a referendum to look at this as well. And I think that, we're going to see, not in an American market yet, the vast majority of consumers and supporters and stakeholders from the cannabis legacy industry and space believe that we're going to get America. That everyone can get licenses and we can all set up dispensaries and we can all play, and they don't seem to see how well sewn up all of this already is. So thoughts?
I think you're right. I mean, I think there is definitely a risk there to how we can ensure legacy markets are enabled and not pushed back and not prohibited against. Ultimately, that there's been enough prohibition, so it shouldn't be a legislative reform that continues the prohibition against certain elements of any community. I think that's absolutely wrong. So I mean, I do think you need to look at when you look at reform. I think Thailand's a good example of doing it the right way. You need to go and look at decriminalising and then release anyone that has been charged with possession. And I mean, it was a nice added touch that they gave back the 14 tons. I think they gave back that they'd confiscated off people that they then gave back to those same people or other people to start a business basically with. I mean, that's that sort of, and then giving out plants to the population just for their own health and well-being as well. And all they have to do is register, and then they're perfectly allowed to cultivate plants in their own space for their own personal use. I think that sort of approach is the social equitable way to really approach it. And then they are now looking at, okay, now what regulation do we put in to enable businesses to operate in the sector? Because I think for businesses to operate, there needs to be an element of regulation. But equally, I think for consumers and from a personal level, there should be the freedom, and there shouldn't be a need for a legislation around it, if you like, and that enables both businesses to go and interact with other things like stock exchanges and potential investors and partners on projects or whatever those different ventures might be around the space, but also allows the public to consume in amount that they see suitable.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I came back through, give a lot of feedback. You make a very valid point there in that the end of cannabis prohibition should end cannabis prohibition. And this is one of the things that we see in quite a few regions in America. California is one of the ones that comes to mind, where about 80% or an estimated 80% of the market, as in what is sold on the market, is still illegal, still from the legacy market, not through regulated means. And it seems to be that it just doesn't fit what the people in the community want, what the people have been used to. They've already had a certain lifestyle. So then it feels to me that in a lot of ways, this modern version, first iterations of legalization, or to borrow a phrase, Prohibition 2.0, it's about creating a square hole, and then they've come to us as a rectangle community and gone, get in the fucking hole. And we're just not. And so they're trying to shave bits, and they're wrong. And it's going to take us decades to figure this out, and many people are going to go to prison. People are still going to fucking prison. We're now starting to see potential federal felony murder charges in America for kids getting into edibles and shit. We're moving into a dangerous space here where a toddler that drinks alcohol, that gets a hold of alcohol or whatever, it's a tragic accident. Do you know what I mean? Whereas then suddenly cannabis, it was in a legal space and it was fine, it was a legal product. All of a sudden, woof, no, there's still these hangovers of stigma and of discrimination in various areas that, again, I think we need to underpin by celebrating all of the potential non-narcotic properties of cannabis and the benefits of that, and proportionalize it and put it on a fucking pie chart, and then actually go, if we did this right, 98% of the use of cannabis would be for industrial and commercial means. Then a small percentage would be for medicinal, and then the rest of it would be for just, we like to get high.
That's definitely the volumes. I mean, any of those industrial uses will be where the volume uses are going to be. And I mean, if we looked at the flip side, if we were just going to use biomass that was from flowers produced for human consumption, if that was allowed for it, there'd be a very limited volume of biomass compared to sort of the volumes that we'd need to go and to have the impact on whether it be energy production, whether it be construction, etc. So I think it definitely is about looking at, it's back to that solution, solve the problems with the solution, and the solutions it can provide multiple different problems mean that it's hard to really keep pushing back against it. And I think that's the bit that'll finally get it, break down those barriers. And all those, I do think all of those barriers they're not going to probably go instantly. Like I said, there's different things that can happen quicker, just because of the timescales that certain elements of legislative reform will need. The UN, the big barrier is still the UN Single Convention on Narcotics. That once that document gets revised, which I think there is people looking at, that potentially sort of accelerates a lot of other global legislative reform. But I think, yeah, it will come. You only lose when you stop fighting, so we just got to keep fighting.
Very true. Very true. You raise a very valid point, and it's something that's been kind of mulling around in my head for a while. And this is more your thoughts than I suppose you can't really give me a defined answer. I don't really think there is a defined answer. But Uruguay, Canada, various parts of America now, to some lesser degree, Israel very shortly, certain parts of Australia very shortly, are all in contravention to it. As far as the anecdote that I was given by somebody in policy making a few years ago, the way that Uruguay got around it was they removed their signature to the original convention and then re-signed it, because there's a clause in the convention that basically states that it has to respect the jurisdictions or regions and the laws, traditions, and religious rights there within. And so basically Uruguay changed its law, stepped out, stepped back in, and then also, we're fine. As far as I'm aware, Canada haven't done this. So Canada are openly in contravention to this. Canada are also leading a march where they are producing something under the auspice, as far as I'm aware, of it being an adult consumable drug. It then doesn't sell in that market, somehow accidentally gets mislabeled as a medicinal product and shipped around the world. And yet no one's looking at this. Interpol isn't seeking Tilray or Curaleaf for any of these big boys. You know what I mean? We're in a very odd position where the law is openly being flouted, and it's not just around cannabis. You're then talking about fraud. You're talking about proceeds of crime. You're talking about big shit. Yet no one is looking at. So what is there any movement from the conversations of people you've been around in any country or sector of people going that that's the thing, that's we can get rid of that, or at least have an open conversation about that. The hypocrisy, if nothing else, means that it can't then go back into its little folder and onto the filing cabinet unchanged. We have to at least go, well, oh, well, they're allowed it because they're special. No, we have to have that open debate and conversation. So do you think there's space for that? There's an appetite for that?
I think that there is starting to have that conversation. I think on that UN level, because I mean, it's that I don't know if you've read any of the work that Kenzie Rement's done, but he's done a lot of work on how it's about interpretation of that document. So I mean, I think there's a review going on anyway, but there is also some sort of fairly clear and robust sort of different routes that people can go down that would allow interpretation and still allow them to be a signatory to the convention, but also have cannabis reform within their own country or jurisdiction. So I think there is ways to do it, but it's down to appetite and whether people are willing to interpret it in that way. And obviously that comes back down to, is it a vote winner or not? And I think bit by bit we are seeing that more and more people are in favour of reform. And you look at different surveys, like the numbers now compared to 5 years ago, compared to 10 years ago, it's definitely a lot more acceptance. And I think that goes because it's, to a certain degree, there's a de facto decriminalisation through policing potentially in some jurisdictions, not others, but I think there's a normalisation and an acceptance that actually cannabis consumers aren't causing problems for the police. Generally, it's the potentially the black market supply of is part of the problem still, because that's still in the black market and controlled by illegal entities rather than regulated entities. So I think there's a case there that actually you solve a few issues with legislation there, but and that's across all drug policy reform as well, to be fair. But I think it's got to keep pushing. I think if we can get the UN to start talking, which I think they will, and there's more and more countries showing appetite and interest to address it, that's also the bit I think that again means that there's that pressure on them. I suppose the reason that they haven't gone and sort of tried to enforce something against Canada is because it's whether it's a micro policing sort of level or whether it's that UN level, whether there is that much interest or pressure from entities within the UN to go and do something about what may or may not be in convention of or contravention of the convention. So I think, yeah, there's got to be sort of, if there's enough voices there shouting, we don't like this is bad, go and do something about it, then they probably will. But it's probably not the case. And actually, it's the opposite, where more and more voices are starting saying, well, we're going to have a go at doing this, actually, and we're going to do this with ours. And this is how we interpret it. So we want to put this reform in place.
Well, yeah, interpretation. Oh, sorry, I'm getting loads of feedback from my mic there. Interpretation is an interesting one because I had a conversation. We had Daryl Bickler on podcast not that long ago, currently non-practicing UK solicitor. And we got into it about language and the law, and really fascinating and interesting conversation. And one of the points he makes is about the Misuse of Drugs Act, and that if that was actually utilized correctly with science and wasn't manipulated and using trickery, that document could stand today and regulate all drugs. That we could supply and have all drugs within society, because the usage of a drug is not abuse. You know what I mean? If you then, I was going to say, should weed up your ass, that's using it wrong, but you're not. You could make it a suppository and it'd be quite useful and therapeutic. So that's a bad example. But you know what I mean? It's trying to smoke crack in your ear. There you go. That's abusing it, or misusing a drug rather. Do you know what I mean? And then abusing a drug is individual. It's interpretable through the individual. You can't say you are abusing that drug. That's just not how it works. Do you know what I mean? You don't go to in a McDonald's and say to somebody that is larger than the average individual and go, you're abusing this. You're just not allowed to. It's just not the etiquette. Do you know what I mean? But if that person seeks help for it, then there are the services and whatever else. So I think the same is then true of this document, of the UN single convention on narcotic drugs 1955, which is obviously the foundational document that leads to the 61, 71, 88 and all the other amendments and all that lovely boring bedtime reading that I'm not going to bore my audience with. But yeah, I think if we could really interpret that correctly, and again, every fact had to be verified under consensus, current scientific means, that the structure of that document would probably work quite well. because it would then mean we'd have to acknowledge the therapeutic benefits of, well, frankly, at this point, the vast majority, if not all, narcotics that are currently criminalized having some way being discovered or rediscovered recently to have some form of utility. So again, it would then be the dangerous drugs that have no medicinal benefit. We then, all right, have that legislation, enforce it. What's that? That's like crocodile and those kind of ridiculous homemade things that are in and of themselves consequences of prohibition. Whereas if you then had just opium available, like we did back in the day, some people would smoke it, some people wouldn't. Some people would problematically smoke it. But you know what? Some people drink themselves to death every day. They gamble themselves into fucking poverty. You know, they've fucked themselves into soreness. That's for sex addicts. That was a rough, terrible one to finish on. That's probably what they were thinking as well. But the point is still that it's that judgment thing at the end of the day. And if we provide the service, and again, the biomass element of this, could you imagine? I pitched this to my MP before she retired. We had a place down there, which colloquially at the time called Hemp Gardens. It's Cannabis Gardens or Hemp Cannabis Gardens, whatever you want to argue about. But basically, it was a disused bowling green, and they had some council-owned land next to it. And I looked into it, and about 22, 23 years had passed, and they'd done fucking nothing. So we started doing pop-up events there, and we'd get like 500 people down there. We'd have like 20 stalls selling weed openly. Police came down sometimes and harassed us and kind of just begged for meetings and scared them off by being so inviting and welcoming. They were expecting us to just be like dangerous criminals. But they had this disused bit of land, and I was saying to them, like, what if you then created a community garden? So you made it all into allotments. And we got people that I know, I could name at the time, I wouldn't name them personally, but I could name like 10, 12 different growers that are wasting somewhere in the region of 250 to 1,000 litres of soil every cycle. And the council are spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds picking it up. What if we then just put a few little closed skips? You know, stalks biomass went in one side, fucking soil went in another. And it's those sorts of things. We can solve more of these problems by working together. The so-called black market, the unregulated market, is not the enemy. There are elements within it that very much fucking are. The human traffickers, the violent, vicious thugs. But the majority of people that I know and have operated with for decades now are just decent entrepreneurs. They're criminalized, creative experts in a field that hasn't yet matured. And they deserve a space within this as much as anyone else. So I agree with regulation would solve a lot of problems, but the regulation also needs quite a large, loose, interpretable space for just people to exist. In the same way, like Heinz is not fucking bothered if I grow tomatoes at home and press it and make my own ketchup and give it away to a few people and stick a little label on it. There's an issue when I sell that, then there's hygiene, then there's health and safety, then there's etc. But the idea of me just going, I agree with this and here's a little label, that needs to exist, because if we then end up with like a whole nation of, I don't know if people have seen South Park's interpretation of like the weed industry with Randy and Integrity Farms, where he's like narking on people and trying to blow up people's home growers and protect his industry. As long as we don't end up with legislation that is protective of this capitalist industry and it allows the people to flourish, we'll have this reciprocal relationship and they'll get that feedback from the consumers, and they won't do what 9 out of 10 of the Canadian big boys are doing, and just pissing money into the wind, hoping that something sticks eventually.
Well, that's it. When you've only got you could have a veg patch in your garden, you could grow a load of fruit and veg, and you could make a load of chutney and jam, stick a label on, and give it away to people, etc. You could even go and sell out at a local craft event, etc. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. You're allowed to do that with things like that. So absolutely, we should be able to do things with like that with cannabis as well. And I can't see how they could reform legislation without having those elements too, because I just don't think they'd get away with only doing the one without the other.
Well, it's what people want. Look at Colorado for the first 12 months, Washington, New York now, Washington State, DC still in some capacities, pop-ups. New York with all of these on-wheel weed dispensaries and what, that's people just want to be left alone to fucking smoke. And so New York, I think, has done brilliant where they've just gone, just let them fucking smoke on the streets, because that's what they want to do fucking anyway. And it's the same as just someone steps outside, smokes a cigarette. But yeah, we're talking about banning sort of with secondhand tobacco smoke in open ed spaces is a contentious conversation, because actually, again, when you look at the science, there's very little evidence there, unless you are literally blowing that tobacco into someone's fucking face. So these arguments to create smoke-free cities and all the rest of it, bullshit. All you're doing is creating a vast underground cigarette market You know, we in the UK, we've known this for decades, man. Every year they increase that duty, and every year fucking hundreds of people drive across the fucking channel, fill up the fucking vehicle, and drive back and sell them at discounts from council estate houses across the fucking country. All they're ever going to do is create more problems unless we as a stakeholder are brought forward to this. So is there, I'm asking almost as devil's advocate here as much as anything, is there within sort of the CIC or within the APPG that you're working at the minute a space, a conversation, a champion, a bastion, a hold for people to have these voices as consumers that are not stakeholders in terms of I've invested in this or I've got this brand or this IP or this whatever?
Sorry, that was a wife.
But clock out, right? But yeah, is there champions, people championing for consumer voices? Because I feel it's the one thing the industry are going to miss massively in this country. If they build it thinking they will come, I'll tell you what, they fucking won't. Because as soon as you're allowed to do it, everyone else will just do their own thing. And unless there is this reciprocal relationship where, yeah, we're going to need mass. So if you want to then be a farmer in the UK and produce, then all right, you don't need to also be the dispensary front, because you can't run that. You can't make a custom dispensary that'll fit in Wigan, that would fit in Glasgow, that would fit in fucking Luton. Do you know what I mean? It needs to be the local people doing the local thing, but they can't then grow all of that weed in Luton. So we need each other for this to really work, I think, sort of moving forward. And yeah, I'm just curious, are there many people sort of championing in those spaces?
Yeah, no, I see where you come from, Simpa. And I think, to a certain degree, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of different elements within the CIC. At the moment, the CIC's sort of position is that it's not necessarily lobbying for adult use, and the rationale behind that was because of the overall membership felt there was a severe need to address issues in some of the medicinal market with regards to patient access and or lack of quality of products, etc. And potentially, if there's a focus on adult use that equally is always going to take 18 months, 2 years, there's 18 months or 2 years of a protracted conversation around that. So there is a working group, it's a scoping group, sorry, it's not a working group, it's a scoping group, which is basically regular meetings and addressing that. I think you probably know quite a few people who are in it, to be fair.
Oh gosh, I was going to say I'm in it. That's why I was saying I was playing devil's advocate earlier.
Okay, yeah. So, because I was going to say, yeah, Callie's doing a good job of Callie Seaman's doing a good job of heading that up, and I think absolutely it's very important conversations to be having, because, like I said earlier on, we need to have that end of prohibition being the end of prohibition, and not still having prohibition of some elements of sectors, because that might work commercially better for other people's business interests. It needs to be done in the right way for all.
Yeah, I completely agree. So a lot of people that sort of listen to this, for all I do actually end up with quite a lot of people from the industry and the sector that are, you know, stakeholders, policy makers in some way in their different regions. A lot of my audience is still just sort of consumer based. So what can the average cannabis consumer look out for? How can they prepare themselves for this incremental future? Because a lot of them are sat waiting for, you know, California 2.0 to just suddenly happen overnight in the UK, and myself included in some cases sometimes end up poo-pooing or shitting on, I don't know why I censored that at the start and then said what I was going to say anyway, these incremental steps, when actually, yeah, we need to celebrate them, because they are still creating more a groundswell, a larger awareness. All of the pebbles into the pond are still eventually going to lead to the ripple where the waters hit the shore. And what sort of advice, what sort of thoughts can you pass on to them to, I guess, encourage them in some ways?
I mean, I think that keep trying to talk, keep have the conversation, keep using the words, try and engage with whether it be people that they work that in the local community, whether it be friends, relatives, whether it be they contact their local MP and say, look, we would like to have conversations about this. I think the more that there's an awareness and a normalization of the words, and it goes back to the point of, if we term it industrial cannabis, it normalizes the word cannabis and makes people understand what we are actually using. And that's why I'm a big believer it is the route we should be going down. So I think people having continued to have that conversation, and don't be afraid to use the words, and don't be afraid to engage with as many different people as they meet on a daily basis. And have those conversations, because bit by bit, as a population, as people understand, the education gets out there. If there's anyone that's involved, I mean, I'm always a big believer that these types of conversations are really important, and I'm always happy to support any events that allows us to have a sensible educational voice for people and explain to them what can be done. And I suppose as well, it's to try and move it outside the industry echo chamber as well, and get it into the conversation, into the wider sectors, because they're the ones that we need to fully engage and educate. And then once we can get their buy-in as a whole, everything will grow for everyone moving forwards, and we'll start having the impact that needs to be had.
Yeah, man, for sure. I'm just thinking that, to go back to my sort of earlier anecdote, what does the law say if you happen to have a facility that can process cannabis fiber and biomass, and you found a load of cannabis biomass, or somebody gave you a load of cannabis biomass? Can you hold it? Can you produce it? Basically, what I'm thinking is, I was thinking, what is direct activism here? And I was like, it's guerrilla growing a house. It's just going, fuck you, no permits, boom, there's a house. That's what it can do. Come look, invite people. Come look, Mr. Politician, look, we built this from weed that was growing in people's bedrooms, from warehouses, from whatever, all clandestine around the country. Here's the processed material. Do you know what I mean? Because we need, I think, statements. We need, whenever we look at movements, there's always like Rosa Parks on the bus. There's always these sort of moments that we think of, or these individuals and these things. And I think we need a totem, an object, a symbol that kind of goes, that's the two worlds meeting. That's the technology, the application, the potential future. And here's just one smidgen of the potential of the biomass that's produced in bedrooms across the country.
I mean, I think the problem we'd have at the moment is that the infrastructure just isn't here for those construction materials. So, other than trying to process that biomass by hand, in essence, or there is a very small hand-fed decortication unit. But again, I'm not aware of one being in the UK at the moment. They're about €12,000. Called a Herbmaster 1000. That would allow you to process about, I think it's 2 tons every 3 days. So it's hand-fed. It's not high volume, but you could potentially do something on that sort of scale to then separate that biomass into fibres and into shivs. You'd then probably have to go down the traditional hempcrete route with the shivs rather than sort of a block type system, because again, you're just going to, but that's fine. You get the binders, use the binders, and you could potentially, it'd be harder to turn the fibres into insulation, because really you do need an actual non-woven insulation line to produce insulation. But you could potentially use some like bio-based composite binders and make some panels, that kind of thing. So I think there'd be a few things you could do. It would need probably about 30-50K of sort of capital to get the right equipment in place, and then obviously it's some time, resource, and quite a bit of man hours to actually process the biomass. I mean, legalities wise, it's an interesting one. I wouldn't like to it'd be interesting to bounce off a couple of the lawyers in the sector, because technically there's going to be next to no, if not zero, THC within the biomass. THC being the controlled cannabinoid that obviously is that everyone focuses on and is the one that's legislated around. And the way the hemp licensing works is that the biomass, or the straw, as long as the flower and the leaf are destroyed, the straw is an uncontrolled part of the plant. So, if, in principle, if there's no flower and leaf on the biomass straw, whether that would be deemed to be an uncontrolled part of the plant still, I think there's probably a bit of the case to that potentially.
Okay, so we need a Damien Hirst type artist to be like, oh, we've got a concept for you, because I think just the juxtaposition of an illegal house at a point where we have a housing crisis in this country and our housing market is about to collapse. It's just, and again, it's the concept of literally like, get a bit of land, grow the shit here, process it here, build the houses here, repeat. I know obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but actually with investment, the second, third, fourth generation of this technology we can have mobile, we can have we've seen this with everything. The first generation shit is bulky, it's heavy, it's mass, and we're still again massively limited in terms of the research that you can do with these things, because you can't in most jurisdictions do the active research on the machine, because you then need the material. You can't get the actual material, so you do it on the next best, or you do it on theory, on maths, and it's not evolving like it would in principle in the field. But yeah, I think as an artistic, that's a Banksy thing. Anyone know Banksy? Hit me up. No one knows fucking Banksy. but you know what I mean? Someone like that, that's all you need. An eccentric fucking artist and one or two growers, actually. I probably could think of a few boys that could produce enough biomass to make a house. So I think in terms of an artistic endeavor and as an act of rebellion, and again, there's the juxtaposition of a council coming and destroying a carbon negative home, and it brings up the conversation and just forces all of this into one conversation of going, well, cannabis is homes, cannabis is jobs, cannabis is the future.
Yeah, absolutely. No, see your point, definitely. But I mean, I think it could potentially be doable with something. Is the way you could do it without even the processing. Whether there's a way you could say you can need to probably process it, chip it up. There might be a way you could do it even without that, using like hiring a wood chip or something like that, and chipping up straw small enough, and then combine it with some binders.
I mean, there are some obviously traditional techniques that are used in regions around the world that we just haven't bothered having those conversations. We fucked off there and stole their genetics, but we haven't discussed like how they use it and how, you know, you've got certain people operating in tribal regions, whether it be in sort of Tibet, Pakistan, Afghanistan, northern India, Nepal, that are growing the same genetics from like 400-500 fucking year ago, and they've been processing the fiber ever since. They've been, using as building materials, using it as other things for a long fucking time, and it is using those traditional techniques. And again, I feel like the cannabis conversation, it needs a bigger tent. And I know that it'll get loud and it'll get noisy, but this conversation is going to require people to dedicate their lives to in niche areas, and then at the end of it, present their volume to the encyclopedia, so that eventually some generation in the future will get to where we were and beyond prior to prohibition.
Yeah, where we should have been without it.
Yeah, man, that Star Trek future feels ever closer to me. It does. Yeah, no, it does. I'm rebelling against my own thought processes there. Damn it, it is. It's getting closer, at least on the timeline, if nothing else. Looking at my notes here, I'm trying to think if there's anything we've missed. Just general touch base with what is happening with CBD in the UK. It's one of those things that I've checked out of, because the conversation has become so nuanced and removed from the mainstream cannabis conversation that I struggle to keep abreast of it. So could you catch us up a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had novel foods. I think there's a bit of a sort of a potential review of novel foods, and maybe a novel foods 2.0 that's going to get looked at and discussed. I think there's certainly some of the frustration from within parts of the CBD industry is obviously novel foods. As much as it was a step to regulate a market, regulate a product, it's also been very, very stifling for any innovation, because you haven't been able to launch new products, etc. So I think there's been certainly it's almost gone flat, if you like, because other than continually sort of selling the existing products, it's prevented that sort of quite rapid innovation. I think we were seeing prior to novel foods. There was lots of different products getting developed. So I'm not saying all of it was good innovation. I'm not saying all of it was good products by any means, but there was a lot going on with regards to innovation, and I think that's just stopped dead at the moment. So I think there needs to be a way for the FSA to allow that innovative sector to continue, but still, personally, I think if it's whole plant and full spectrum, there's plenty of evidence of safe consumption, albeit we never used to record the cannabinoid concentration of the products we get consumed, but they were in there. They haven't just suddenly appeared in there. It's not like the cannabis plant just suddenly developed cannabinoids now. So if it's being consumed, then those cannabinoids being consumed. So I'd like, personally, this is more of a personal thing, I'd like to see a decoupling of whole plant extractions in their natural ratios, and I don't think those should be anything to do with novel. And then if you're going to start refining extracts up to high concentrations or isolates, etc., or synthesizing cannabinoids, absolutely, I think then that needs to go to a certain level of safety assessment, whether it be for toxicological or the other elements that we looked at. But I think if it's something that's in its natural ratios, cannabinoids are present in the plant, personally, I think there's very little safety risk to that product, and therefore it shouldn't necessarily go through all of the hurdles that are required for novel foods. So I think there's, I think we will see it's like anything, isn't it? There's like we said earlier, every bit of regulation, 1.0, you get 2.0, you get 3.0, and eventually hopefully you get somewhere down the line of something that is sensible and works for the majority. But I suppose the upshot is that it was a start. It's a stab in the dark at something that globally wasn't really. It was a bit of a hot potato. There wasn't much going on federally around regulation. The FDA only just now starting to look at regulation around CBD in the US. So Europe, EFSA were sort of going, "Oh, how do we do this?" And with Brexit, the FSA has sort of said, "Oh, well, we'll just copy that and make a few slight changes." I think that the bit that's a barrier at the moment, or that I can see potentially changing, is like at the moment the FSA focus on the end products, whereas EFSA in Europe focus on the primary ingredients. And I think that to me makes a more sensible approach if you focus on primary ingredients. Ultimately, if the primary ingredients can be proved to be stable at X, Y, and Z durations, X, Y, and Z strengths, put them into different carrier oils or different formulations or with different flavors, because your USP is I want to put it with something that's some different terpenes that are going to be beneficial for sleep or mice reading, all those types of innovation that people would be looking at. I think there's I think that would make a more sensible approach, but ultimately we'll have to wait and see if there's any consultations, interactions. I think we are also going to, I'm hearing rumours there's quite a lot of purchasing going on by different trading standards and different. So I think what we'll see is probably a little bit of enforcement clamp down as well off the back of the novel foods regulation, and now finally getting through. Obviously, there's a lot of extensions. I think it's 1,200 odd products that are listed now, but that also means there's maybe a few that are sort of playing the grey area that's not so grey now, which is they're still on sale, but they haven't actually got listed for whether they can supply information or just chose not to go down that route. I also think there's a few that are sort of portraying to be exempt from novel foods because they're cold pressed, which again I think is not going to carry any weight really. Unfortunately, I think it's in an ideal world, like I said, natural ratios of the cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids from the plant should be exempt and non-novel, but my understanding is they're currently not. And then when you start, I've seen quite a few lab certs of people say, "Oh, this is a cold press CBD oil. It's 5% cold press CBD oil." Okay, yeah. So and then you have a look at the lab, and it's actually 5% of CBD, not CBDA. It's like, well, hang on, if it was cold pressed, it would be CBDA. So you can't decarboxylate it that much, even if you did get a little tiny bit of heat during the cold press process, and certainly not enough to get it all decarboxylated perfectly to CBD rather than CBDA. So I do think there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors where people are just putting isolates into cold presses and stuff like that, which again isn't good for the industry. I think we need to be transparent for consumer protection, and there's enough of smoke and mirrors going on anyway that I think that needs to. And I do think to a certain degree, novel foods would probably remove some of that smoke and mirrors and add a bit of transparency and consumer protection in there as well, because I mean we've seen some of the results that have come out, and they've done different analysis, ring trials, etc. And bottom line is, if you're selling someone a product which saying it's got X in it, it needs to have X in it, not 10x less than what you're saying's in it.
Yeah, exactly that. There's so many. Where the early days was Wild West, we had just cowboys and wild claims, and I agree that some regulation has been beneficial. I think novel foods make sense, but only when there's a robust cannabis regulation, because novel foods, as you said, to me it's extract, but it then seems that they're leaning more heavy and not even necessarily distinguishing between synthetic and naturally extracted. So the regulation makes a lot more sense if we just remove natural extracts. We just remove the natural cannabis from it. And that is just a CBD regulation. Yeah, anything that is formulated for CBD that did not derive from or be directly extracted from a subgenus and cultivar of Cannabis sativa L, that should be regulated under the same regulation that will ultimately eventually regulate the commercial sale of adult use, because it's all of the consumable parts of the cannabis plant. It would just make sense that they have to fall into it. So I can see how and why it was supported by some elements, and I can see why some elements are thriving under it, but they don't have the longevity. Again, this CBD market is only working because there isn't a robust cannabis market that would include whole plant cannabis, that would include all of these. I mean, there's some wonderful breeders out there at the minute doing some amazing work that are cultivating high dose CBD back into a lot of the traditional heirloom genetics. So you can have all of the flavors of your youth with whatever CBD you want back into it. And they're extracting from these, they're being able to, use actual cannabinoid terpenes, and they're being really mindful. They're doing the research into the carrier oils. They're doing the research into the effects, whereas a large part of, it's not discriminating against anybody within that pile of the novel food individuals, they're just there to sell CBD. The conversation around cannabis, la 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 la, don't want to have it, can't have it. That's going to affect our bottom line, and we're not cannabis. We sell CBD. It's a wholesome extract from the hemp plant, which is the worst sentence I hate in my life. Hemp plant. It drives me. That's one of the things I'm triggered by. I can deal with in this conversation. I've done really well at hemp sliders, whatever, because we both know what we're talking about. I think we established well, the audience know what we're talking about. But when somebody says this came from the hemp plant, something in my head explodes, and I'm just like, it couldn't have. There's no way in hell it can have. And it's one of the things I'm glad trading standards are in a way looking into this, not because of the, I want authoritarian rule or whatever else, but the language on the packaging is something that deeply worries me. In Europe, anything that is a botanical extract has to list its botanical source, and it has to be what it is, and it can only be Cannabis sativa L italized. And the fact that that's not done is just the hugest red flag to me. And the companies that do, I respect the living shit out of you because you take flack for it. I've seen companies go under because they were cannabis companies and not CBD companies. Yeah. They didn't want to bend to the whims of the system and say, no, we're hemp, and hemp is the good one, and we're not associated with that dangerous marijuana.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my biggest frustrations to that same sort of note is when you hear, and it's led from a lot of government policy as well, but talk about THC as a contaminant in a product. It's like, it's not a contaminant, it's a natural constituent of the plant that the botanic the extract's been derived from. Why would you call it a contaminant? Yeah. Unless you're purely focused on an isolate CBD and therefore anything in there is a contaminant. But then it is frustrating, some of the terminology that's used, and it's back to that. Let's use the proper terminology and ensure that we treat it as the crop that it is. And ultimately, I mean, it's if the more we allude to allowing that language to continue, the more we'll find it diversification through regulation or legislation that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, exactly that. And I'm quite hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. I'm comforted by knowing that there are champions like yourself that are in these positions that can have the opportunity and the vision to be able to go, wait a minute, and just bring a bit of hindsight and a bit of rational sensibility to the conversation, because too often they end up getting locked into this. And one of the things I heard sort of not too long ago of the medicinal industry, and they consider cannabis as a cannabinoid delivery system that is delivering CBD and THC in specific ratios, which is fucking hilarious coming from the pharmaceutical industry, because they don't know the taxonomy of the plant. Which bud did you take it from the top or the bottom? How close were they to the light? Were they overfed, underfed? You know what I mean? Your batch,
315 compounds in it.
Yeah, and exactly all of these other things. They're going, no, it's THC and it's CBD, and they're testing this in vitro and doing all these experiments. Going, well, it's doing this, and it's like, yes, to a limited degree. Imagine how much more if you leave it the fuck alone. And it's weird that we almost have this thing in us that we're trying to protect this core idea that cannabis is evil. It's bad. It may so happen to have a good thing in it, but if we can just get the good stuff out of it, we can leave the bad devil plant alone. and they just can't. It's back to those two authoritative individuals of just this. It's something structurally ingrained in them. They can't see it. They just can't understand it. And then on the other side is the youth that all they can see is this. So I see kids around here, man, and they're all running around dealing. They're all creating their own brands. They're all networking. There's more events than ever kicking off in the UK, and all power to them. They're not quite the activist focused ones that I took part in my early days, but all power to them. You're still doing the same thing. You're still spreading the word. You're building communities, and I just want them to have the opportunity to operate within this. And we have to bridge that huge divide between the purse clutching grannies reading the Daily Mail. No offense to any purse clutching grannies that read the Daily Mail. And the youth on the streets that are 18 know far more about this plant than people that have got academic degrees in it, because they were taught about this one little tiny part of it. And they learn, oh, I know how this molecule ascends into this and that this photosynthesis. Like, yeah, where's the relevant there? You ever smoked a plant? Have you ever grown it? Have you ever been around the culture? Have you spent a night around people smoking weed and understand what they talk about, who they are, how they operate, how they interact? Those are the things that I feel are vitally important. And I can see a day when there's going to be like an equivalent to a university degree now for botanical sort of for in botanical, I can't get the sentence out, in botanical studies around cannabis, there'll be an almost recognized one of a street degree. If you actually grew the fucking thing. All right, you did it for 5 years on a high street and didn't get caught. How many plants? All right, we want this guy. This guy will keep our neighbors happy. This guy, you know what I mean? And I just want to see that come to fruition. I think, as I said so before, as I'm circling around this long anecdote, I think people like yourself fill that space wonderfully. So more power to you, and anything I can do. Obviously, I'll still be in the audience shouting at you whenever I see you, making sure that cannabis gets a fair shout. But yeah, man, it's good that people like you have taken up this mantle and bridging these worlds.
Well, cheers, appreciate it. And no, likewise, keep doing what you do as well, mate. It's about having those voices out there and just keep educating. Eventually we'll get there.
Exactly that. Conversation to change the world, and more to be had. Many more to be had. I think this is a good place to round up the podcast. To see the sun is setting as well. So the bloody, are we in winter yet? It feels like fucking winter.
Yeah, I think we are officially now. The clocks have changed and everything. We've got to be in winter now.
Oh, yeah. So therefore, audience, this is what you're going to see forever now in little old northern Britain. It is going to be dark and dreary for the next 6 months. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of ring light on my face for the next couple of dozen episodes. But yeah, Jamie, it's been a fucking pleasure. I will drop some links below to sort of your work, where you're at with different things, and any news that we've kind of mentioned in this. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. You have two options now here. You can either sit around and watch me do housekeeping, or you can go off and enjoy your evening.
Okay, so no, cheers, but much appreciated, mate.
All right, I'll let you go then.
Take care. Cheers.
Peace. Bye. There you go, folks. That was Jamie Bartley. I enjoyed that conversation. Always just smoking for small space and barely see. Trying to see how badly my eyes are closed because of how stoned I currently am. But no, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I think it is, as I mentioned there, great that we have people like Jamie filling in this ever-growing void between the ignorant kind of prohibitionist and the avid evangelicalist. We need science. We need application. We need demonstratable models, and beyond just theory and conversation. So if you're going to spare 60 million quid or whatever the figure was that he was talking about, give him a shout, let him get one of these projects off the ground and prove this shit. Equally, if you happen to have a small decortication machine and you want to build a house illegally in the UK, hit me the fuck up, because that would be an amazing project and something that I would love to participate in. And I think I can help gather some of that biomass just probably within a mile of this spot, to be honest with you. All right, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this project. If you did this podcast, sorry. If you really enjoyed it, please do like, share, and subscribe. Please do check us out on all social media platforms at Simpa Life. Give them a little like and follow as well. And yeah, check us out on Patreon. Chuck some monies if you think it's really worth it. Appreciate every penny. Helps yeah, with my ever-expanding electric bill, which is actually going to get worse, I've just thought, because we're going into winter. Bollocks. I'm going to have to try and record with the 3 hours of daylight we get in the Northeast every year. Anyway, folks, I'm rattling on. I'm going to let you go. It's been a pleasure. We're back next week with the legend that is Danny Danko. So really looking forward to that one for our 100th episode. And yeah, it's been a pleasure and a privilege as always, folks. Peace and love. I will see you next week. Have I press record? Yeah. Immediately, have I press record? God damn it.